Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in just a few minutes as we let people kind of come in on the Zoom. Thanks for being here today. We're excited to talk with Kim about her book. We'll just give everyone a few minutes to get on the webinar. Kim, this is always like an awkward little silence. So I'm always like, I always threaten I'm going to make Marian sing because they're actually a very talented singer. So I'm always like, you should provide accompaniment for this awkward, silence.
Oh, I love that. I had to take voice lessons in college.
Okay. Well, maybe
I'm not good, but it was just the requirements. I went to school for music business and they
Oh,
wanted
wow.
you to be able to do music, which I was like, that is all right. I can sing one aria when I'm drunk.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. That's a skill.
Party trick.
Love that. I can't even do that. Awesome. We're just going to give it one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm seeing some of my favorite union members in the chat. Hello. Hi. Nice to see you.
Oh gosh, already outing myself as a dirtbag to everybody. It doesn't count until we start.
Until you start, for sure. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our book club event featuring author and journalist Kim Kelly and her book, Fight Like Hell. My name is Samantha Gordon. I'm Tech Equity's Chief Program Officer, and I'm really thrilled to be here today and to be in this conversation. I'm really honored to have Kim here with us today to talk about her book and her work as a labor journalist and activist. Before we get into it, and I ask Kim to talk about herself and her work, I wanted to do just a couple housekeeping things to get everyone on the same page, starting with just letting you know who we are at Tech Equity. If this is your first time joining us for an event, at Tech Equity, we're a nonprofit. We address inequities in the tech industry and inequities that result from tech's products and business models. We do that in three main ways. We do education for the tech community, like events like this. We put together public policy and we advocate for public policy changes around our issue sets. And we issue corporate practice recommendations so that these companies that say they want to do the right thing, we give you a comprehensive way, a set of ways that you can make conditions better for workers overnight, should you choose to. The two areas we focus on are housing and labor. And we want to thank all of you for being here today. We love doing these events. If you love that an organization like ours exists and that we're doing the work we're doing, I would just encourage you to become a member. You can become a member by contributing $10 a month or $100 a year, or feel free to let us know you can't do that, but you want to get active. We'd love to plug you into our various campaigns. Couple other quick things. One is we use a code of conduct in our chat, which Herman, our community manager, who's working hard in the background, will drop a link to. But essentially what it says is we try to create a safe space for learning. So please be respectful of other opinions, even ones you might not agree with. And then we have ASL interpretation provided by Julie. So if that's something that you want to take advantage of, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and it will feature her video so folks can follow along. And then finally, we're going to use time at the end for questions and answers. So please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen versus dropping a question in the chat, because we might miss it. And we'll be able to have the opportunity for people to ask questions of Kim when we get towards the end. Okay, I think that's it. So thank you, Kim. We're so excited to have you here today for our community to learn more about your book and also just your work. And I know for myself and a lot of us, I became familiar with you when you were reporting on labor at Team Vogue. And I do this a lot, but I really mean it. Like, I think inarguably some of the best labor reporting that's been happening in the country. I have been a longtime labor movement member. So grateful to you for the work you've done and the amount of care and attention you've put into telling other people's stories. So I wondered actually if we could start with hearing a bit more about your story. So wondered if you could tell us who you are, where you come from, and really what helped shape the strong and thoughtful perspective you have on workers' rights.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice. Well, flustered already. Yeah, so I'm Kim. I've had a sort of interesting, I hate the word journey. It feels very like self-help book, but I've had a pretty unorthodox entry into this world, right? Into the labor world, into being a labor reporter, an author, all these things I've been doing. I never really expected to do any of this. My whole plan actually for most of my life was to become and then just be a music journalist. And I
Mhm.
did that for like 20 years. I have something due today. I still write about music. But I ended up in the labor space, the labor world, the way that I think most people do. I helped organize my workplace and I got really excited about the whole thing. I was working at Vice in 2015 and we unionized and I got super involved. I was very, very stoked. I was on every committee, every meeting, every bargaining session. I had a great time telling my bosses to get fucked.
Right.
Um, sorry, I should try
That's
not to
fine. You're good. You're
swear
good.
as
Don't worry.
much. Clearly, I'm a very polished professional is what I'm saying.
Listen, we're
Uh,
the same movement. It happens. Don't worry.
right? Like I spend the first, well, my entire life in the music business, specifically in the heavy metal world, where as a journalist and a promoter, and I did PR and I toured with bands. Like I've slept on floors in 48 states. There's a reason that I look like this and I have such a hard time dressing up for like functions because I do not know how to do that still. I just kind of landed in this world, but it worked out really, really well because it turns out labor is the most fascinating thing in the world. And people power, collective power, worker power is the most magical thing in the world when it comes to actually trying to build and create the world we want to live in and take back the power that's been stolen from us throughout centuries of exploitation. Um, one of the reasons I was so excited when we unionized at Vice, besides the fact that we were getting paid shit, and 2015 in Vice in Williamsburg was a wild place to work. We'll say, like, I got plenty of skeletons on all
Yeah.
kinds of people,
Yeah.
but
We've read some of the stories. Yeah, we believe you.
Lord. But one of the reasons I was personally so excited to get involved is that I'm from a union family. Like I'm from a very like rural, blue collar, working class background. I grew up in a nature preserve in South Jersey. My whole family worked construction or in the steel mills or they're teachers. So growing up, I always knew that unions were a good thing. I just never thought it'd be something that applied to me because I wrote about death metal on the internet and sold t-shirts to drunk dudes.
Right.
I did not realize that there was, a union that would take me or be interested in the work I did. I didn't even really have a grasp of my identity as a worker,
Right.
because my job was fun. It was creative. All these things that you internalize when you actually get to do a job in a field you care about and enjoy. It wasn't until I became involved with the union at Vice and got to know our organizers and our lawyers and just the cinematic universe of labor people in New York City that I really internalized, like, oh, like I'm a worker, I'm part of this movement. I need to bring other people into it. Like, this is awesome. I got to tell people about this.
Totally.
And I was already freelancing at the time because Vice wasn't paying shit. So I needed to. But I just sort of saw in myself as my focus shifted a little bit away from what I was covering towards trying to sneak in labor stuff and try and find a way to mix my day job with what I wanted to be writing about because I still love heavy metal more than almost anything, but writing about it for 20 years, eventually there's other topics that you become interested in occasionally, and for me that was labor, and I started pitching around a little tiny bit, started writing a little bit for Teen Vogue, and that really kind of opened up more opportunities because, like a lot of writers know, you just need one or two good bylines.
Yeah.
You need proof that you can convince that you can do it and use that to convince other places to let you write about stuff.
Totally.
And I just did that a lot. And by the time I got laid off in 2019 from Vice, I decided to just say, fuck it, I'm going to be a labor reporter now. See how this goes.
That's amazing.
And yeah, about a year later, I signed the contract for my book. So it looks like I might have pulled it off.
Amazing. Congratulations. Quite a feat.
Right? Like, no one saw that one coming.
That's awesome. Well, shifting towards the book, Kim's book. I'm going to hold it up so people can see. It's Fight Like Hell, the untold story or the untold history of American labor. It takes readers through different industries and time periods, and it moves really beyond the stories that have been, lionized in our, albeit very limited understanding of US labor history, and expands the view. And the book is so well researched, and it's so big and wide ranging in the stories it's telling, right? It's got women working in the mills in the 1800s, to the sex worker movement that was being built in San Francisco, to the forming of the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. It is vast. And so I think the obvious question to start with is, what spurred you to write this? What were you seeing or not seeing? And what gave you the motivation to do what I imagine was a really extremely time-consuming research project?
Sure. And it sounds almost a little bit hokey, but it's the book that I wish I had had access to when I first started being interested in labor and in organizing, because, and of course, people that have researched this and who are historians who have dedicated their lives to preserving these stories, without them, this book wouldn't exist.
Right.
I'm really glad that they've done the work they did, because I got to swoop in later and benefit and try and pull together all these different pieces and maybe sort of rescue some of the people from the footnotes or from the sidelines where they'd been placed and focus the spotlight on them. I really took the same approach to writing this book that I took and still take in my approach to writing about music, about heavy metal. Like, I always wanted to write about women in bands, or people of color in bands, queer folks in bands, people doing things that were interesting and unexpected for what people, like the mainstream view of the culture was. And that's basically what I did with this book, right? Because we're told there's this avatar of the American worker, a union worker. And here in this country, it's almost always defaults to a white guy in a hard hat, guy who looks like my dad.
Right.
And who is weirdly conservative and has there's all these sort of qualities ascribed to what a union worker is.
Yeah.
And that's one type of person, and they're out there, and shout out to the ones that are cool. But the rest of us are here too, and arguably have done even more work than those guys, because we've had to fight harder, whether it was, Black Southern women in the 1960s pushing for the right to vote and the right to have their labor professionalized and legitimized and respected, or indigenous silver miners going on strike when the settlers showed up. Like, there's so much and so many people and so many campaigns and situations in this book that I was so delighted to be able to zero in on. Even something like focusing on Maria Merino, who was a farm worker organizer in the 1930s, and she became the first female farm worker to be hired as a union organizer in the lead up to the United Farm Workers. And she clashed with Cesar Chavez because he thought she was too bossy. Like,
Right.
all of these people, like, most of us know about Cesar Chavez, as we should, but far fewer people know about Maria, who's putting in that work while parenting 11 children, while working in the field herself. Like, there's so many examples like that I just really wanted to focus on. And I was writing this book earlier in the pandemic where I couldn't go nowhere. It was just me in this room with a whole bunch of library books and Zoom calls and texting my friends in academia at 3 a.m. to send me a PDF on JSTOR I couldn't access because
Right.
I don't have that edu email address.
Right.
I initially had all these plans to travel to different labor archives and go and sit down here and go explore here, right? All these plans to go out and do things. And then pandemic showed up and was like, oh, you're not going anywhere.
Right.
So I had to recalibrate all those plans. And it still worked out. Thankfully, most people will still pick up the phone, but it made it a little tougher to source all the materials I'd wanted. But, I gave it my best shot.
You did a great job. It's extremely comprehensive. When I was reading it, one of the things that really started to stand out to me was, I've been a union organizer prior to being at Tech Equity for a long time, and I'm a person who believes deeply in collective action and worker power. And one of the toughest challenges I've had, both when I'm organizing workers, but also just like talking to people in my life about the power of organizing, is that I'm sure this is familiar to folks who have been in this. Sometimes people will quickly pivot to the racism or sexism that's embedded in some unions or exemplified by union leaders, or maybe a bad experience they had with a particular steward or a rep. I struggle with it because those are really valid critiques. Even though I feel that those critiques and experiences don't fully represent the movement, I want to give space to them and honor people's experiences. And one of the things that I really just immediately, like I said, jumped out to me and I loved about your book is that you own that. You explicitly discuss the racism, classism, sexism, ableism, all of the isms that take place even inside like a quote unquote hero story of someone that's done a really amazing thing. And, I think some of the examples of this, some are probably more familiar to folks, like you delve into the rejection of Bayard Rustin by multiple Black liberation and civil rights groups because he was gay. But then you also include in that story the way that he played a central role in keeping women out of the spotlight at the March on Washington, right? The story you told of Ah Toy, a Chinese sex worker in San Francisco who experienced incredible amounts of sexism, racism, xenophobia, and eventually had the industry that she built wrested away from her by men. You also talk about the role she had in actively enslaving Chinese women to perform sex work. And so I wonder, as you wrote this book and brought forth the stories of marginalized people who have been invisibilized intentionally often in our past, how you thought about tackling that challenge, that mess, right? And the imperfect humans within these movements that you're chronicling.
Yeah, it was a little tough, right? Because you get so excited, you find this cool person with this fascinating story, like, oh, this is great. I think it's thinking about Atoya when I found out about her and then just digging around. I was like, oh, this is great. This is an awesome example of a worker I can highlight. And then I read about that whole thing where she participated in the sex trade in that way and exploited and enslaved her fellow workers. Like that sucks. That is awful. But that's true. It's something that happened.
Right.
And her like people, even our favorite people have flaws, right? So someone who it's human, right? You're not going to tell the real history, the real story of what happened without acknowledging the bad stuff. We've all done shitty things, some more so than others,
Right.
but that doesn't mean we didn't exist, we didn't have an impact, and that those decisions we made didn't inform the way that we approached other things. Like what the person I think about the most in this book in terms of complicated figures is Lucy Parsons, who's been one of my faves forever. She's like this incredible towering figure that somehow hardly anybody knows about unless they're interested in anarchist history or radical Black women's history or the IWW. Like she was one of the most famous, if not infamous, Black women of her time, this fire-breathing orator and writer and activist. And she was one of the like if there's a Mount Rushmore, like a not colonialist awful version of Mount Rushmore for anarchists, she would be on it. And she also she was a Black woman who denied her own ancestry. She told people she was Spanish, and she essentially ignored the plight of the Black working class and focused exclusively on white factory workers and did not really make any effort to connect with that part of her community. And she also, and this one's gnarly, when her son, Albert Jr., wanted to join the army to go fight in I think it was World War One, she had him committed to a mental institution. And he died there from tuberculosis. So that is, what do you do with that when one of your heroes has also done things that are either, not cool or actively horrible? Well, you put it in the book because it happened.
Right.
And if we want to actually understand these people and the conditions they were living and organizing and working in and the impact they had and how they inform what's happening now, you have to go for the warts and all approach, even if it kind of hurts. That's just what humans are. That's one thing that I think is important to get across, like in this book, in my writing, in labor writing in general. Like we're all people are flawed. They're mostly doing their best, but sometimes their best doesn't look that good. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't matter. It's just acknowledging that we all have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really powerful about doing that is like it's true, and it's important to hold people accountable for harm they've created, right? Even if it's historical. And I think complexifying people makes us less vulnerable, right? Like to when, there are union fights, right? This happens all the time. A worker gets held up on a pedestal, lionized by the campaign, and then the boss works hard, right? Like I think Christian Smalls, like that was an example. Amazon was
Sure.
trying to undercut him constantly by telling parts of his story that weren't being centered. But I think if we can prepare for that people live in the gray and that people are capable of being held accountable and changing, right? It allows us to not be easily defeated by, bosses and corporations using that against workers. So I really appreciated that about your book and thought it, felt really honest and full of integrity to hold people accountable and not put rose-colored glasses on the experience. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think I got a review. I got a couple reviews saying that it was still too like rosy or cheerleading about the movement. I'm like, okay, well, I'm pretty posy and I like this stuff, but still, like a lot of my faves in there do not come out smelling like roses. So
Yeah.
give me a break.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like if you're telling the truth about history, there is no clean story. We always want history to be clean, right? And it's not, it's
Yeah,
really messy.
we all fucked up. I've fucked up. Like we've all no, yeah, no one's perfect. Even the people that you think about getting tattooed on your arms. Like I'm still gonna get a Lucy portrait because now I know. I think it makes you value these people's contributions even more because you know, like, oh, you weren't just this perfect ideal, like a person, a poster. Like you were a human who was kind of a hot mess at some points, but what you did still mattered. And I
Right.
think that gives people hope. Like even if you feel like I'm not, like I'm just like I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. I couldn't do something that impacts people. I couldn't help. I couldn't lead a union or organize this. Yeah, you could, because all kinds of other people have done it too. And they were
Right.
just as fucked up as you are.
Right. Another thing that I really thought was interesting, going through the different stories in the book is that I thought you did a good job of highlighting for people how inextricably linked immigration, work, and policy choices are to worker power, to the shape of our current even labor force. And I noticed this, you talked about Larry Italian in the book, and I've been an organizer here in California, and I'm really grateful because I've organized side by side with Filipino workers who are very well educated and very committed to preserving, his legacy. So I was excited that I knew who he was when I read about him in your book and knew that story. But I was thinking about just how place specific some of those stories are, right? And how lionized people get. And, I learned reading in your book about the movement in Hawaii, right? And the ways in which white colonizers were bringing in different groups from different countries in Asia to try and undercut organizing efforts, wage raising efforts, things like that. And that's a story that I think I'm very familiar with from organizing in the South and in different parts of the country. And I wondered, just given that history and some of the patterns we see in present day, were there patterns that you noticed in researching the history of these movements or different campaigns on different parts of the US and which leaders get lifted up and which get sidelined, and just do you see parallels to what happens today from learning more about that history?
It's so it's illuminating and so frustrating to see how some things have not changed at all.
Mhm.
And for throughout history, depending on where you were, what was happening, what your job was, and who you were, if you were trying to organize, if you were trying to get a raise, if you want to go on strike, if you were trying to cause a little trouble, invariably your boss would bring somebody in who is a little bit different from you and try and use them to split you apart.
Yeah.
Like the example you talked about in Hawaii, where there are all these different workers from different places, different languages, ethnicities, races. They were segregated and separated in these work camps at the plantations where they worked. And the bosses intentionally did that so they wouldn't organize, they wouldn't talk to one another. So when it came time for this big strike, the union realized, like, okay, we can't let them pit people against one another. We're going to make sure everyone is together. Everyone, we have translators, we have community kitchens, we have all these different mechanisms to build real solidarity and understanding. And that example really resonated because at the time I was writing about that, the Amazon Staten Island union was getting going and they were using some of those very same tactics, whether it was like having barbecue in the parking lot or making sure people spoke, like people who spoke each other's languages could connect so everyone felt heard and understood, which is kind of how they won.
Yeah.
And just seeing that principle applied to other types of organizing throughout the country now and throughout history, that's how we win, right? Like for a long time, the women and men, because it's at a point where it's hard to find info on like other genders, so a lot of it's just women and men in this one at least. But women and men were pitted against one another. Oh, these women are going to come in and we're going to pay them less, and they're going to take your jobs and you're not going to like that. Or for a very long time, and also now, like Black and white workers, we had, even right now in California during the hotel workers strike, but the hotels hired a bunch of workers who are Black to come act as strike breakers. And then one of them, at least, I think his name's Thomas Bradley, he said, oh, I see all this happening. He joined the picket line.
Right.
And that's the kind of solidarity that builds real lasting community and understanding and empathy. And that's how we move forward and get past the boss's tricks. But throughout history, there's always been this not impetus, like this tactic by bosses to keep people separated, to use the other to make them feel like their place in society, their place at work, their money, their livelihood is at risk, whether it's immigrants from other countries or people who came from a different part of the nation, or people of a different gender, spoke a different language. Like, how much rhetoric do we hear right now about immigrants stealing our jobs, and how much of that comes from people within the labor movement?
Right.
It's just it's so disappointing to see people giving into that kind of divisive rhetoric, because we know it doesn't work. It works for the bosses, it doesn't work for us.
Right.
Whether it's like the AFL endorsing the Chinese Exclusion Act back in the 1800s, or certain unions now talking about immigrant workers trying to come in as if they're not even human. Like, it's just sad, because we should know better, because we have 300 years of history showing us that the only hope we have is to work together and care about one another and understand one another and value each other for all of our differences.
100%. And I think that's a good segue to the next thing I want to talk to you about, because it comes up a lot in your book. Is the corollary to that is this idea of a multiracial coalition, right? And there were a lot of stories that centered around the attempt to build that, right? And for people to come together. And there were, a lot of bosses who tried to defeat it, as you were just speaking to, union leaders who were wary of it. And stories of how powerful it became, right, when people were able to do it. And I think, that term, the multiracial coalition, multiracial democracy, multiracial campaign, it's getting tossed around a lot now. And I think it means different things to different people. And I think there are also fair questions about who should be able to set that and who gets to craft it and when is it a liberatory strategy. But one thing that stood out to me is that it's really potent, right? Because bosses hate it. It's hard for people to do. And the power and perception of race and class and our isms, they don't go away just because we want them to, right? And so I wondered, you were just referencing some of them. So, maybe it's included in there, but just from your experience reading about these attempts for multiracial organizing through our history, and then some of what's happening, present day, if there are lessons you think people can draw on, or particular stories that stand out to you that can be powerful for people maybe on the ground trying to figure this out, like how would you talk to them about that?
I think I jumped the gun a little bit on my last answer.
No,
Right?
it's
A
great.
couple
No,
of my examples.
you answered it in a lot of ways, but just also wanted to put a finer point on it if there's other pieces to add.
Yeah, I think a lot of it also comes down to understanding and acknowledging that not everyone's workday looks the same, and that some workers are more vulnerable, they're more marginalized, even people within your own union and or your own workplace or your own organization, your block. And realizing like, okay, maybe for some of us that means maybe I step back and shut up, or just ask what I can do to help. I'm not negating my involvement in this. I'm not any less or more than anybody else, but some people have been silenced for a really long time, and maybe I could be most helpful just kind of standing behind them and helping out. I think in terms of being silenced too, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it does make me think about it, where we talk about who gets to be remembered, who gets to be lionized, who gets to get the spotlight. A lot of the folks in this book and throughout labor history they were, I think, intentionally pushed into the shadows because of who they were, because it was, a Black woman or a brown woman or an Indigenous woman who was speaking up too loudly or pushing too hard or had politics that were too radical. Like Emma Tenayuka, for example, an organizer in Texas who was completely blackballed and kicked out of the strike she was leading because she was a member of the Communist Party. There were a lot of communists in labor history.
Yeah.
That's just the thing. Whether or not you like it, that's true. And a lot of anarchists, a lot of socialists.
Right.
And we're still out here. And then just because you don't like someone's particular political worldview, like as long as they're not hurting anybody, you could probably find some common ground. Like when I go down and talk to coal miners in Alabama, sure, there's stuff we disagree on, but coming to the point of, well, there's rich people that are running our lives and people deserve better, and I'm getting screwed over at work, and maybe we should organize and do something about it. That's fertile ground, fertile common ground,
Right.
And I think a lot of people's workplaces can probably find that similar type of common ground. And a
Yeah.
lot of workplaces, I think so many people, the only place you're around people that are unlike yourself are at work or
Yeah.
maybe at school. But that's like, for a lot of people, that's maybe the first time they encounter someone with a very different lived experience, and organizing around specific issues or for a union contract or against a shitty boss. Like that's how you learn about each other and realize, oh, we're not really that different. We're all getting screwed. And that's the light bulb that gets us somewhere, realizing, oh, we're all getting screwed and there's more of us than there are of them. So, okay, maybe we could work with this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so powerful when you see it too, right? Like I feel like being on campaign, seeing it is a place where very few opportunities exist in a lot of people's lives. We live very segregated existences because of our housing policy, because of our history. And so, yeah, seeing it happen in work is just a beautiful thing. You just brought up a piece of the book that really stood out to me was the coal workers, coal miners in Alabama. So when in the book, for anyone that hasn't read it, Kim's epilogue tells a story of warrior met workers who were on strike. It was 1,100 coal miners in Alabama, and you were covering the strike as you were concluding the book, and the strike was ongoing. And ultimately, that strike lasted 2 years. It was 2021 to 2023. I learned this from you, so if I get anything wrong, interrupt me. And it was resolved without the workers getting what they wanted. And I read your follow-up piece in The Nation, and you had outlined all the different, pieces that contributed to that, right? Like the high price of coal that was kind of unexpected, the ability of the company to bring in scab workers, the lack of enforcement for the company's unfair labor practices, bad faith bargaining. But one of the things that you highlighted and that I noticed too is the media coverage on this strike was really minimal. You were one of the few reporters talking about it. And in your book, you write about how abandoned the workers were feeling during the strike. And in your follow-up piece, you say the same. And so I wonder, with this modern day story, why do you think there are some stories that aren't being told, even as there's a rise in labor reporting and interest?
I think some stories are are seen as a little too complicated, and some workers are seen as more sympathetic than others. And also, I think, there are more people covering labor, and that is phenomenal. I'm friends with a lot of them. I respect them. They're wonderful. And not everyone comes from the same background,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, like for someone like me who's from, like, everyone who raised me looks and acts and pretty much thinks exactly like all those guys in Alabama I was talking to. So I was very comfortable with with that community. I was like, oh, okay, I get this. But
Yeah.
that's because of who I am and where I'm from. Not everyone would feel like that. If there was a different group of workers in a different area, I might feel like a fish out of water, and someone else might be like, oh, okay, these are my people, this is fine. So
Yeah.
much of it comes down to the individuals who are given the privilege of covering these stories, because I think it is a privilege we get to do this. And coal miners who mine coal in Alabama, which has its own image problem thanks to its horrific government officials and powerful rich people. That's a little bit of a hard sell already, right? Because coal, complicated. The
Yeah.
world is on fire. We
Yeah.
know this. The
Yeah.
coal miners know this. The coal executives know this. Everyone knows this. But it's still being mined, it's still being pulled out of the ground. And the folks in Alabama, they're mining metallurgical coal, which is not keeping the lights on. It's being sold overseas to like China and Germany and just other industrial nations. So that's like a complicated little piece of it. Like who cares about coal miners? Who has sympathy for coal miners, especially coal miners who, not all, but a lot of them are really conservative religious folks, live in rural Alabama. A lot of them voted for Trump. A lot of them are, on that side of things. And they're allowed to be that. They still deserve to be safe at work and be paid properly and to be treated well like every other worker. But that adds another wrinkle in that sympathy thing, right? Like, I totally understand why some people be like, oh, well, if that's their deal, like, I don't care. Like, I'm not sympathetic. Like, you're entitled to that view, especially if if your identity and your background is threatened by the very existence of those views. Like, I get it. And it was harder to get people to care about them. And also just in terms of like the political things at play, since it's coal, it's Alabama, a lot of folks were conservative, like Democrats didn't care. They're like, well, they're not going to vote for us. We're not going to do anything about that. And then all the Republicans that a lot of them voted for, that a lot of them had faith in, they completely ignored them too. Not a single, statewide or even local politician from the Alabama GOP showed up or showed them any support. The Birmingham DSA did more for that strike than any Republican politician in Alabama, because they understand the different nuances involved. They were great. And other labor movement members who donated to their strike pantry, they were great. But all of that to say, there's a lot of layers. It was a fascinating story. It was a complicated story. It was infuriating and heartbreaking. And not everyone is interested in that particular type of story. There's other stories I'm not as interested in that other people are covering. Like, I definitely don't want to be seen to be denigrating other folks doing this work.
Right, of course.
I think this one, I think some balls were dropped on this one. And I think there's a lot of like, it's not fair. And if these folks are getting ignored, who else is getting ignored and why?
Right.
I happen to get so deeply involved in this strike. I got really close to a lot of, especially the women, like the spouses and former coal miners. And I cared so much, I just kept going. Not everyone has the time or ability to do that. I'm freelance, so I just kind of finagled my way down there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just an example of a more complicated story that there's not an easy good guy, bad guy dichotomy there. Like, obviously, coal boss is bad, coal miner is good, but there's layers.
Right.
And, I could write like a whole dissertation. If I knew how to write a dissertation, I could write a whole dissertation about that. But yeah, it comes down to the type of story being told and the people it was about and the industry it was in, and just all these kind of outside factors that the workers themselves couldn't really control.
Right. Of course. Yeah. I mean, I thought that was such a fascinating example because of all those layers. Right. And I think where I'm from, similar, the unions really strengthened over time the sort of nature of civic engagement in my town, right? And as unions dissipated, so did democratic politics, so did other pieces, right? Because there was no place where people were building that critical lens, deepening their thinking. So there's a part of me that's biased towards it too, because I'm like, where else are they going to wrestle with these topics, challenge some of their political beliefs, think about whether these Republicans actually care about them or not, right? And so there's a part of me that wants to stay focused on some of those stories because I think it's critical to breaking some of those like myths that live in people's minds, right? Based on their race and their geography.
Some of those folks are straight up socialists now. They saw
Right.
who showed up and who didn't.
Right.
And so much comes down to showing up. Like, as organizers, that. As workers, that. If you show people you actually care about them, they're going to listen to what you had to say.
Yep. Absolutely.
Like, if I was like a big time political person who wanted people to vote in a different way, I would perhaps think about that.
I know we probably have time for one more question before we open for Q&A, but one thing I would love to hear from you on is, the book is truly, it's a labor history textbook, right? It could easily be used in high schools, college classrooms, union halls to educate a new generation of workers about a fuller version of their history. I'm curious, what do you hope people will do with the book?
I wrote it and structured it in a way that I hope workers will just read it on their lunch break or on the bus ride home. Like it's bite sized. It's a big book, but it's
Right.
bite sized, and you can kind of choose your own adventure depending on what you're interested, who you are, what resonates with you. I wanted to write something that pretty much everybody could at least see a piece of themselves in. And I tried really hard to make sure it was as diverse and inclusive as I was able to get it. I think I got it pretty good, but there's always room to improve. But I wanted to write something that will give people hope and inspire them and show them that this is their movement too. Like no matter who you are, where you come from, what language you speak, who you love, how you identify, like you have a place in the labor movement. Like we need you.
Yeah.
And just to emphasize that, here's some stories from other folks who did it 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago. If they can do it, so can you. Like that's sort of the underlying subtext of the whole thing. Like, hey, you can totally do this, And I mean, it would be really cool if people decided to use it in classes or in union education. And I just want people to know that they're allowed. You're allowed to do this. That was something when I was organizing at my workplace. I remember being amazed, like, oh, we can talk about how much money we make. We can ask Eric why he makes so much more money than us. We can tell the bosses this isn't good enough.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to do that. I'm just like some redneck from South Jersey that fell into this. But it turns out like we're all allowed, especially people that are told they aren't. So it's
Yeah.
so important to me to add chapters on sex work and incarcerated workers and disabled workers,
Yeah.
because we're made to feel sometimes like we don't fit into this movement or like we have our own thing going on.
Yeah.
No, it's all completely intertwined. And I feel like I have a little bit of a broken record on my slogans, right? But just saying that we're so much stronger together, like that's what I wanted people to really realize. Like it's not a bootstraps, dog eat dog, I fuck you, I got mine kind of mentality. That's what got us into this terrible position. It's us taking on them and remembering that we outnumber them a whole lot.
Well, I want to open it up. I know Marion Wellington, our Director of Communications, is going to come on and tell us some questions from the audience.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, Kim, for joining us for this conversation, and Sam for moderating. It's been so fun to listen and learn from you. So, and also thank you to everyone who is in the chat and in the Q&A. This is a really wonderful group of people. I don't know if I'll be able to get to every question, but we'll try. Someone asked you, Kim, as an independent journalist, do you have any thoughts on the connection between the private equity-led hollowing out of local news and the precarity in journalism that has come out of that, and the ability of labor movement to make the general public aware of the issues that vulnerable workers face?
Oh, that's a good one.
Just a light question.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to think, like, hey, how do I answer that? Thoughts on company and the ability of labor movement. That's like kind of two things, right? Like private equity is destroying everything, whether you work in a coal mine or whether you work at a digital media outlet in Brooklyn. Like they're coming for all of us, right? The ability of the labor movement, probably general public aware of issues. Oh, one thing. So this is like a silver lining. Even though private equity, very bad, destroying our lives. The only thing about this current state of affairs that I think is kind of neat is the fact that so many workers now in digital media and traditional media were unionized, right? Back in 2015, I mentioned my experience at Vice, and we were just I think second after Gawker, RIP, of a bunch of media outlets we unionized with my union, the Writers Guild of America East. And the News Guild also got involved in organizing digital media. And there's kind of been this big wave of journalists who have become involved in their unions, who realize, okay, we're part of this too. I think that's adjusted the way a lot of journalists see themselves in relation to these stories. And it's armed a lot of them with just knowledge they need about bargaining and contracts and just labor stuff in general. And the thing about being a journalist, at least in digital media, at least now, is you get laid off all the time. I got laid off. All my friends have gotten laid off. I haven't had a job since 2019 because I know I'm going to get laid off again. And the only little silver lining to that is every time another group of workers at a union outlet gets laid off, it's like, I think of it like taking a dandelion and going, and all those little seeds end up in different places. Either they're freelance or they start a newsletter or they get another job somewhere else. And all those writers and editors and media workers, they have that pro-union, pro-labor experience now, and they just got fucked over by private equity. So now they're really a little bit more motivated to let people know about how evil they are, or at least report on more labor-centric stories. I think that that experience, the precarity and tumultuousness of this industry, it kind of primes you to be a little bit more sympathetic and empathetic towards workers in other vulnerable industries or exploited industries. Like, obviously, the jobs might look different, but being treated like you're worthless by your boss after being told how important you are, that's a pretty, not universal, pretty widespread experience. And when you have that experience, and then you also have the ability to write and edit and publish stories, that's going to bleed in. I think there's a huge correlation between that wave of organizing in digital and traditional media in the past 7, 8 years, and the amount of pro-worker, like pro-labor coverage we're seeing. Because like we did that, we organized, and then we got fucked over, and then we ended up all over the place. And I think that's the negative parts of that trend are going to continue, but the positive parts of like people caring about labor and understanding labor and being able to write about it where people will read it, I think that's going to continue. Yeah, I could talk about that forever too, but I don't want to.
I was gonna add to like the private equity stuff and collective action stuff, they sit side by side, right? Because it's the more they consolidate corporate power and consolidate profit, the more exploited workers get through that chain and the more atomized, right? So it's like you're both experiencing it from unionizing and you're experiencing it as a worker, right? And one of the things that's always been hard for me when I've dealt with the press on campaigns is that they want to focus on one worker, right? Or like use one story to humanize the movement, which it makes sense. I'm not mad at them about it, but it's like, how do we contend with the consolidation of power over here? And we're trying to build a collective movement. And when you just focus on one worker, it makes all the other workers feel like they're not really in it because they're not that worker being profiled, right? So how do we ask journalists to hold that mess, which is really hard. But that's one of the things I've been thinking about of like, you know, who controls media, how do stories get frontlined, you know, and how do we make sure all workers feel seen in the coverage, not just one or two, which is messy.
It is. I do love a profile, but yeah, you're right. I guess it's just a matter of making sure as many workers' voices are incorporated into that as possible and emphasizing the collective nature of it. Like there's, even if you're focusing on one person, one worker, or one leader, maybe, there are ways to emphasize like, okay, this person, this is their story, and they're one of so many others, and they worked with this person. Like there's ways to write it, you know? You just have to have that mindset and that approach going in, like, okay, this is my hook that I can trick an editor into let me write about this with, but let's make sure you bring everyone else in there so it feels more accurate and more respectful of everyone's time. It's all, yeah, I think it's just on us to do a better job. Oh, there's a bunch of questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. One that I know y'all were talking about, you know, a lot of bosses will bring people in to drive a wedge, the people that are different from each other. One question that someone brought up in the chat is about outsourcing and how that's used as a weapon to wield against, I mean, both all the workers that are involved are getting exploited. So the people that are here in the United States, their jobs are getting moved to people in like places like Manila and Hyderabad, where people are far less compensated for their work. And then obviously those workers are getting screwed over as well. So how from an organizational perspective, how can workers grapple with this and defend their own jobs while also, acting in solidarity with workers abroad?
I think it's a matter of messaging, right? Because there's two ways you can approach it, right? Like, these people are taking your jobs and it's ruining your life. Or you could phrase it like, this company, look, it's screwing you over by taking away your employment, and it's screwing them over by underpaying them and using them to undercut and pitting them against you. Like, if anything, you and these other workers you've never met, you're on the same side. You're both getting screwed. It's you against the boss. It's not you against the workers. That's the most important distinction to make, I think, because it's so easy, again, for bosses to use money and privileges and retaliation to pit different groups against each other and say, oh, well, it's just, it's not personal. It's just business. It's them. They'll work for less. They are choosing to work for these little tiny wages that we just coincidentally realize we can pay them if we move there. Like, I think it's just so much just directing the anger and justified resentment in the right direction, like pointing it up, not over or down. And it's just, crafting that messaging and making people understand, like, they're not out to get you. They're getting screwed too. This whole situation sucks. You should be protesting this entire situation, not taking out your anger on these folks who are probably doing a lot worse than you. Yeah, I guess just against punching down, right? Punch up.
That's right. Let's see. For someone who is new to workplace organizing, and this kind of touches on the themes you've been talking about throughout this conversation, how do I connect with people that aren't like me when I'm starting out organizing?
Oh, that's a good one. It can be a little intimidating, right? But there's always something. And if you're working together, that's already you're in. Say you have a boss, everyone, even manager, no one really likes that much. They do something annoying at work. They do something that impacts both of you. They do something that pisses you off. Talking trash is a great way to bond. Or just finding things you have in common. That sometimes all you need is sharing a cup of coffee, or seeing a photo of their kid or their dog, or seeing a pin on their jacket. Like, it is easy to feel like you and another person might have nothing in common. This person doesn't talk like me. They don't think like me. They don't look like me. Like, wait, what am I supposed to do with this? But some of my best friends, we don't make any sense at all. But we found something small. And that's from there, that's how you build. You're even just asking questions, making conversation. How's your day going? Did you see that thing? Like, oh, did you hear about what happened to Jeff? Like, how about them Eagles? It just takes time and trying and social skills, which are hard. You got to build those up. If you want to be an organizer, you got to talk to people. And that can be hard too, but suck it up, or find a different job in organizing that works better for you. Not to be, I don't want to be mean. Not everyone is going to be the person that talks to people. But if you want to be, just remember, they're just a person. And you're both working at the same place, and you're both probably getting screwed in different or similar ways. So you automatically have something in common. It's just finding it and, letting yourself get past any anxiety or any prejudice or judgment you might have. Just finding the human piece of it. You're all just people, and you're all being screwed over. So, who doesn't like a cat picture? Send them a meme. Talk about sports. I don't know, there's always something. Everyone's the same in some way.
We used to always tell workers on campaigns who plans the birthday parties, who does the cake, who's doing all of that. Like, go talk to them, ask how to be included if you're trying to meet other folks, right? You're trying, that's a connector inside the workplace. So we would always ask people, pay attention to who's organizing what, naturally, right? Socially, because they will help you if you go to them and say, I want to be more involved. I want to know my coworkers. I want to understand how to connect with this group. Those people are naturally networkers, connectors, they will often bring you in. They'll be like, great, you need to bring plates and order the cake. Like,
Oh,
so
I
that's
like
great.
that. I used to hang out in the office kitchen and like trade snack tips, like where to find the good snacks, or like, because we're getting paid so bad, like people would kind of create their own lunches out of stuff around the office. Like, I made some pretty good friends just by like bringing them in on my office pizza recipe. So like, if there's food involved, that's the easy one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other tips or advice for workers who are just getting into labor or organizing their workplace?
For me,
For both of you. Yeah.
listen more than you talk. I think that's a big one. And let people, yeah, let people talk. Sometimes it's the same as being a reporter in some ways. Sometimes if you're not afraid to be quiet for a little bit, people will keep talking. And eventually they'll tell you something interesting, tell you something good, and let them know that you're listening and that you sympathize. And I feel trash talk is really, it's really a good connector. Maybe that's it, because my experience, I was like a worker organizing my other workers. I don't know if that's in the official playbook, but being able to talk shit about the same like annoying manager, that definitely helps. It helps foster like a little some baby solidarity. Like, oh yeah, we don't like that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a good initial start. And then part of the hard work is like building a deep enough bond that it can withstand as it gets harder, right? Like, but that's a good entry point, I think, for people just to commiserate about like what's messed up, how this is happening, to be kind to each other when they see someone being treated badly. I mean, I think the other thing is I would ditto what Kim said, like we teach us the 80-20 rule. Like only 20% of the time should be your own voice, 80% should be listening. And if it's flipped, people are not going to follow. They remember what they say, not what you say. So let people talk. And then the other would, just trust other people's experiences and try to meet them where they are, so you don't have to convince everyone in conversation one that like your pathway or your belief about how to get there is the way, right? Like your job is to build a relationship, to what Kim was saying, and to listen to them and understand their experience, because it might change your mind about different opportunities, different strategies, and to not feel like you have to convict everyone overnight or you're not going to be successful. Like it takes time, there's ebbs and flows, and to just kind of trust the process. Find a good organizer, find a good leader who can help coach you.
Sweet.
Awesome.
Do you have time for one more, or you want to wrap up?
I think one more and then we can wrap.
Talk fast.
I think this was early on in the conversation. So just any other thoughts on how can the progressive movement move forward, accepting people who as they are holistically, rather than tearing them down for any flaws they might have?
Oh, that's an easy one.
Yeah, so quick one at the end.
Huh. I mean, that's something that I've like thought about a lot, just in terms of my own labor reporting and covering workers whose worldviews and politics diverge very far from mine. I think it really does come down to embracing that basic humanity and understanding where people are coming from. Not in a, oh, it's their opinion, but like, what's their life been like? Like, what if they're expressing a viewpoint you don't agree with or you don't think is okay? Why are they saying that? Who taught them that? Why are they holding on to that? Why is that the lens, like the lens they're using? What's going on there? I think just being interested in people on a human level will help you get to a point where you can accept some of the flaws. Like some things are not acceptable, obviously, right? If someone's out here being racist or transphobic or homophobic or any kind of phobic or ist, like that sucks, not acceptable. We got to talk about that and get them to understand that's not okay. Even if they want to be like that in the privacy of their own home, like they're not bringing that into organizing spaces. They're not bringing that into the work you're doing together, or they're not going to be welcome. I think that's important. But if it's a matter of someone not really understanding or having the right language, but having the right spirit, or showing that they're interested, but being a little like, oh, I don't know about all that. Like, I think you can tell when someone is reachable and someone isn't. And I think there is a little bit of an impulse, especially online, to maybe flatten that. If someone says something that isn't worded correctly, or is harmful without them having the intent behind it is just kind of a fumble, you can give them a little bit of grace. You know, like some people are trying. Some people are assholes, but some people are trying. They're just trying to catch up. Not everyone has the same access to resources and education and knowledge and community that everyone else does. And yeah, showing a little bit of grace. If they're showing up for the cause that you're there to support, they're there for a reason. There's probably other things you can talk through and get them to a point where things feel better for everyone. And maybe they have something to teach you too. Like we just have a little bit of grace, because we all fuck up, even, and especially if we don't mean to. Maybe there's some room to help someone learn or help them feel more included by saying, oh yeah, so the way you said this, that's actually not cool because of this, and I know you didn't mean it like that. Like, just going forward, like, that is a pretty chill conversation to have if you want to get someone to a better place. It's just, you don't need to throw someone away unless they seem like they actively want to throw people away. Like, I think there's distinctions there that are worth exploring and worth putting a little effort into.
Totally.
Well,
I know it's that time, and I feel like ending on that really simple conversation of how do we take people at their complexity and hold them accountable and allow them space. I just want to thank Kim for being here, for writing this book, for sharing your expertise and doing so much work to bring together our history and help us understand that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And we're so grateful to you, and grateful to everyone that joined today. Final reminder, if you like our content, you appreciate it, please, join our list. Let us know if you want to get active. Feel free to make a donation, and we will be sending all of this out as well. It'll be available on our website. And thank you, Kim, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you so much.